let's talk to Mark. No pronouns given. Calling in from the same oligarchy hellscape as one of our last callers, who says there is a strong evidence for an afterlife. Mark, you're on the line with Forrest and Eric. How you doing today?
How's it going?
Never had a bad
Pretty
day,
good.
man.
I don't normally do this, but
we're still doing the pronoun thing. As a Gen Zer, I thought we kind of moved on from that.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but you have forced my hand. No, we still care about grammar here in the 21st century, it turns out. Yeah.
I thought we were sort of into science and, biological determinism and all that.
I'm literally a biologist. Hate to break it to you, science is 100% on the side of trans people, but that's also, pronouns aren't necessarily just a trans thing. My pronouns are he and him. Those are the ones that I prefer. And now you know how to refer to me respectfully because I've given you the opportunity to know that information. That's just how courtesy works, Mark.
Yeah, but I mean, if to the extent that our language is a social construct, then it needs to be broadly accepted in order to become a part of our vernacular. And I reject the idea.
Which is why, yes, it does have to be broadly expected, which is why we do it across this entire channel and also the other atheist channel that I host on and my personal, YouTube and everything like that. And also like every university I've ever attended, all the professors list their pronouns, and a lot of before the Trump administration, like most government agencies and everything, people list their it's just generally becoming more and more accepted as a courtesy thing to do. It started out because if somebody listed their pronouns, they were basically outing themselves as a trans person, and that kind of sucks. And now that everybody's doing it, not only are we, protecting, trans individuals, we're also normalizing the practice of like talking about gender, because it's still, for some reason, widely believed that gender and sex are both synonymous and binary, because that also is just common speech. It's kind of what's accepted widely as like a vernacular thing, even though it's not scientifically true. Eric, what are you saying? You look like you had a word.
I find it funny how people complain about pronouns, but they just won't complain about proper nouns. Because like Mark, when you entered this conversation, you said, my name's Mark. You're basically saying my proper noun is Mark. This is how I am referred to. And I can imagine a society where half of us were like, who cares about proper nouns? You're still hung up on proper nouns? I'm just going to call you whatever comes to my mind when I refer to you. I don't think I don't think that's a good society to live in. I don't think that really is really conducive to healthy conversations.
For sure.
But
well, I mean,
hey, man, you do you. I got your proper noun there. And I'm going to be counting how many times you use pronouns in this conversation, because that's always what's happening.
Already been a lot. It's already been a lot.
So go ahead.
Well, I mean, but to be honest, though, I mean, as a Gen Zer, I think we're, at least in my experience with my colleagues and people I interact with, I think we're definitely going the other way. I think the majority of Gen Zers reject the notion that you can modify your own pronouns. I think we're more traditional in that sense. But I mean, if you feel the society is shifting in that direction, hey, if that makes you psychologically more comfortable, that's fine. But I think
it's not really about comfort. It's not really about comfort. It's really just about like being scientifically accurate. That's the cool thing about inclusivity, is that like more often than not, I actually can't think of a reason off the top of my head that this wouldn't be the case. If you are being more inclusive, you are also being more scientifically accurate. And so like I'm a millennial, but I work with Gen Z a lot as an educator, as a content creator. I've got like, a ton of people watch me on TikTok and stuff like that. Most of them are Gen Z. And I have the exact opposite experience. People are in your generation seem to be overwhelmingly very much on the opposite side and trying to focus more on biological reality and on science and on inclusivity and making the world a better place for everybody. Although I suppose there are outliers and stragglers here and there. But either way, it really doesn't matter what you personally are into, or even if there is a trend. I agree with the idea that language goes by the way of the majority, but science does not. And as I said earlier, biology is very strongly and unequivocally on the side of trans and non-binary people. So like, as long as we keep studying and learning and talking about science, we're going to keep on supporting LGBT folks. And if Gen Z falls behind on that, then I've got to do a better job as an educator to help you guys catch up.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand your sentiment. I think we can kind of agree to disagree on the idea that Gen Z is very pro LGBTQ.
Yeah, we'd have to look
I think in my
we'd have to look at
some.
We'd have to look on surveys on that. So I don't think you come in here and saying, well, I think my generation is this, and we have multiple people in the audience saying, no, Gen Z is the opposite. That's not going to get us anywhere. So
it's really not. Unless if you have
also,
a poll, if you want to bring a source, if you have like a Pew Research poll of like, or a public opinion poll or something like that you'd like to bring up, I'd listen to it. But at the end of the day, it really wouldn't matter because, as I just said, like biology, 100% pro LGBT. So like there's really no argument that be made from a scientific perspective about whether trans or intersex people exist. They fucking do.
Well, there's definitely a strong argument that LGBTQ prevalence in our society is spread through social contagion, and that
absolutely
society.
No, it very isn't.
It is.
There's actually
very.
So
it is incredibly
I chalk it up,
socially contagious.
Mark, I chalk it up to your age. You said you're Gen Z, so I chalk it up to the fact that you haven't had the time or the opportunity to study this in a serious way. But there is actually overwhelming evidence to the contrary. During the 20th century, especially, this was looked into, and the beginning of the 21st century, this was studied heavily, and people tried to find those quote unquote contagions in ways that there were some truly horrific experiments trying to simulate that. None of them worked. So despite the best efforts of scientists to create more LGBT people, it never worked. And despite the best efforts of scientists, of ethical scientists, to find the root causes in a social sense of those things, it never happened. What there is evidence for is that certain sexual behaviors, things like the amount of sex had, the level of safety, the age at which sexual behaviors start, those types of things are very much socially mediated and socially influenced, largely through social media. So like when you start having sex, how much sex you have, what kind of sex you have, how safe you are with your sexuality or sexual behaviors, those things are socially influenced. And that's why sex education is so important. And that's why social media moderation is so important. But there is absolutely zero actual scientific evidence that anybody can be turned gay or trans or any of those things through any kind of social conditioning whatsoever. There is strong evidence against it. What you are describing here is just a conspiracy theory that's been spread by a lot of dumbasses for a long time. So I don't blame you for thinking it. It is a very prevalent bullshit. It's like the LGBT people being groomers and pedophiles thing. It's just a common talking point that gets brought up all the time. It has no scientific backing, strong evidence in the other direction. It means nothing, but it's very catchy. So people like to pick up on it, especially young people.
Well, I mean, according to recent data from Gallup, the percent of U.S. adults identifying as LGBTQ has been increasing. Silent generation, it was 1.8%, baby boomers 2%, Generation X 4.8%, millennials 12%, and Gen Z 21%. Yep. That's strong evidence of that's not just mere societal acceptance. That's a social contagion.
That's not at all a social contagion. So like what you have to think about here is, why is that happening? Why are those numbers going up? There's two hypotheses that we can go off of here. Number one is social contagion, which if that's a hypothesis that matters, remember in science, we never accept a hypothesis, we fail to reject it, right? That's the number one lesson of science. So we have to check this thing, test it. If that hypothesis were true, if that actually had some validity, then we should be able to find like actual reliable ways in which that is spread around, that actually sticks to people. Things like conversion therapy should work, and they don't. We don't find any of that stuff. Another reason why those numbers could be going up, hypothesis number two, is that societal acceptance is growing, and so more people are self-reporting in those categories. So when we do those census polls, nobody's going out and doing like a brain scan and a DNA test and like using some magic crystal ball to see what people's sexuality or gender orientation is. Nobody's doing any of those things. It's all self-reporting. People just write down what they want. And when you talk about, the silent generation, Gen Z, Gen X, all these people, these are people who were very much LGBT people were more stigmatized and a lot more marginalized. There was a lot more oppression. And so they didn't want to come out. They didn't want to talk about this. They were locked in the closet and oftentimes denying it to themselves as well. And they didn't want to be very honest about intimate personal details of their life that were very socially taboo with strangers in lab coats. Now we are more accepting of LGBT people. And so they're able to express themselves and say, hey, yeah, that's me. You can see the same exact thing if you look up, you go to Google right now and look up the rate at which left-handedness was recorded. It used to be next to nobody was left-handed. And then there's a dip in left-handed people, and then it spikes and it skyrockets like crazy, and then it plateaus out, and it's just a flat across the board. This is how many. And what happened is we used to punish people for being left-handed. We called it being sinister. You'll notice in science a lot, whenever we talk about anything left, it has an S abbreviation meaning sinister, because we thought that left-handed people were evil, and that was the devil manipulating your hands or whatever like that. We used to train it out of people in schools, in public school. If you wrote with your left hand, teachers would slap your knuckles with a ruler and make you write with your right. And then we started talking about it publicly, and we see this dip in the graph as it is now stigmatized even further, and it's publicly in conversation, and people are arguing about it. And then we come to a point where we're like, hey, this is actually natural human variation. Humans are just naturally left-handed sometimes, and that's okay. And then we see this massive spike in left-handed people self-reporting as being left-handed. And if you were alive in that time, you'd be saying, this left-handedness is a social contagion. Everybody's going to be left-handed before too long. But what actually happened is it just plateaus out and it flattens out. And we see that this is just X amount. I think it's like, something like 20 something percent, or it's probably less. It's probably like 14% of people are left-handed, period. And that's how it always is. And you see the same thing with LGBT people. Now we're at this time where we're becoming more accepting of LGBT people, and we're talking about it a little bit more, and we're not punishing people for being LGBT, and we're accepting it as a society. And so we see a rise over the past couple of generations, more and more people saying, yes, I am gay, I am trans, I am bi, I'm whatever. That doesn't mean that they're being infected with something. It means they're finally allowed to be honest. And in another generation or two, we'll see those numbers level out, and just this amount of people will be gay. And that's just natural human variation. Again, what you're describing here are just really common just talking points that people who don't know how to do data analysis just use to trick young people like you into hating your friends and neighbors. I'm very happy you called in.
Well,
so we can help
wait. I definitely have to push back against that. I didn't say anything about hating people who I identify in any particular group, but I would reference a 2008 study. Well, but I would reference a 2008 study by Ivanka Savic and Per Lindstrom, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, that found gay men have brain symmetry more closely resembling that of heterosexual women, and lesbian women's brain symmetry more closely similar to heterosexual men, indicating that it is a biological function, which indicates whether someone is LGBTQ or not, which leads me to believe that the increase we've seen is not merely explained by a change in social acceptance.
So that actually, what you just did is completely missed the point. It sounds like you moved on to the next thing that like was on a script. Let me explain what I mean by that. So there's some truth to that. Yes, we do regularly see that brain function, because like there's no such thing as man brain or woman brain or anything like that, right? But we do see patterns in. No, absolutely not. So the idea of like male and female brains is actually seriously outdated by a little over a decade now. There are certain parts of the brain that are somewhat sexually dimorphic, but when we look at like major reviews of like thousands of brains, we find that those dimorphisms, which dimorphic means that like it's different between sexes, we find that these so-called male structures and female structures, they're not internally consistent. And they have very highly from population to population. And so everybody's brain is actually more of a mosaic of what we would traditionally have called male structures and female structures. Everybody's brain is kind of like their fingerprint, and some people's brains are more aligned in this male direction than the female. But what we do see in a dimorphic pattern is activation patterns, right? So we see that like, somebody who has a gender identity of man has activation patterns in their brain that look this way, and activation patterns look this way in women and things like that. And what we do see is that there are some brain regions that do vary in size, and those we can kind of draw trends in, but in activation patterns is way better. And we see that, yes, heterosexual men looking at a woman in a brain scanner have the same activation patterns as a homosexual man looking at a man. That's part of their neural anatomy, right? That is part of the way that their brain works. Some of that is influenced socially, but again, that's like what types of things you find attractive, not like what genders you find attractive. That's something you're born with. And the same thing also with gender identity. When there's one really cool study where we put cisgender people and transgender people in a brain scanner, and we showed them computer generated images of their own body morphing to become more masculine or more feminine. And sure enough, the exact same activation patterns in cisgender people watching their body morph towards their gender identity, towards their sex assigned at birth. And we saw the exact same patterns in transgender people watching their body morph away from their sex assigned at birth. So in terms of like brain patterns and things like that, yes, we see these things are somewhat biological. That doesn't mean that we found a single root cause of these things. And it's very important that we don't try to what we call pathologize these things or make these things out to be like diseases or contagions or whatever, because there's no evidence of that. All of this strongly suggests that people are born however they're born. These things wouldn't be happening if we were talking about a social contagion. That's the opposite of what we would be seeing. So again, what it sounds like you did here is you just ignored the things that I said and you moved on to some other thing that some other podcaster or talking head on the internet or whatever, which, crazy thing for me to say is a talking head on the internet, but some other talking head on the internet said this next thing and said it to be some sort of anti-LGBT thing. And that's just not actually how the science works. Once again, science is very much on the side of LGBT folks.
Well, I would definitely push back on the idea that I'm taking references from some radical, algorithmically encouraged anti-LGBTQ group that I'm listening to. I'm just citing studies and making an argument. Yeah. But let me just bring up some points, though, because you mentioned that there aren't any. Well, let me.
It's just that you moved on to the next thing without actually addressing what I had actually said, and these are points that we hear all the time from anti-LGBT activists. So, like, I'm not saying that you're just like being fed information and thinking taking it uncritically. I just think that you have a source that's being dishonest with you.
Well, I think what I said was directly related to the point, though. We were discussing the prevalence of LGBTQ folks in our society, and I was trying to indicate that if it is a biological function, which I think is what the evidence would indicate, and less of a social contagion, I don't believe that we would be seeing the prevalence that we see today if it were merely a biological function and not something being encouraged societally. And I would,
Forrest,
and also
Forrest gave you. So Mark, on that point, Forrest gave you alternatives to your hypothesis. One is that people can identify a certain way, yet express themselves in a different way because of societal fallout that they don't want to have to deal with. We saw that with closeted gays back in the 1980s and prior. You can identify a certain way and yet publicly express yourself in a different way for reasons. And I want to add a third reason on top of that, a third explanation, hypothesis on top of that. And that is that since as science progresses and as we've studied people in psychology and sexuality and biology more, we have discovered more ways to categorize ourselves. So yeah, go back 50 years, go back 100 years. We didn't even have the labels that people could use to accurately identify themselves. So they went with the labels that were currently available. So there are alternate explanations to what you were considering to be a social contagion, and Forrest is saying, no, there's other explanations, and we can look at the science to determine that or not.
Yeah, and that's the thing, man, is that the science is strongly against this idea. And a great example of that is that, like, gay people and trans people have been around the whole time. We have evidence of actually like records of gay and trans people going back thousands of years. And yet, if you think about, like, when I grew up, there were no gay people on TV. There were no, like, or I guess maybe one, but like in like, cartoons like, for kids and everything. When I grew up, there were no gay or trans characters in the shows that I watched. And yet I still have gay and trans friends that are my age. Somehow, no amount of forcing heterosexuality and cisgender on them changed their minds. None of it was contagious to them, right? And yet you want to pretend that we can somehow spread being gay or being trans. If it works one way, it should work the other way, and it doesn't. We see that this is something that is prevalent across human history, across time and space. Cultures around the world are expressing these things. Go ahead. What are you saying?
If you don't mind, let me sort of push back against that a little bit. I think that,
sure,
for starters, I'll kind of start with the idea that there are no differences between male and female brains, because I think this is really a key point to the discussion. I don't think that's accurate, and I don't think that that is what the science indicates. If you look at a comprehensive study by the National Institute of Health, they analyzed over 2,000 brain scans and found consistent sex differences in brain anatomy. So we're not just talking about functional connectivity, we're talking about the actual structures in the brain. Females tended to have a greater cortical volume in areas such as the prefrontal cortex. Males had relatively greater cortical volume in ventral, temporal, and occipital regions. So like the idea that it's merely a connectivity issue, I think it goes beyond connectivity. I think it's actually the structure of the brain is different. And I think that's important that we flush that out before we kind of expand the discussion out.
So here's the thing, is that I am not a neuroscientist, right? I am a biologist, but neuroscience is not my specialty. However, my second master's degree was in biomedical science, and that did involve quite a bit of neuroanatomy. I also do have friends who are actually neuroscientists, and a couple of professors that actually cover this stuff. In my actual training in biology, I have been taught the exact opposite. And if you'd like, I can cite some papers for you, but I don't think it's really useful. But if you want me to, I can pull some up right now that show that like the brain is not reliably sexually dimorphic in this way. And the idea of male brains and female brains is thoroughly outdated. That is what we used to think, but it is not what we think anymore. That said, as I mentioned earlier, there are some parts of the brain that are sexually dimorphic, moderately, but we're talking about clusters of neurons the size of a grain of rice. So when we look at other animals, this is actually where this idea came from. When we look at, like, say, for example, the vocal control regions of the brain in songbirds, right? Songbirds showed high degrees of sexual dimorphism in the brain with like ridiculously more neurons in this one area, so big of a difference you can see with the naked eye. And same thing in like rats and stuff, right? There's a certain brain region in the brain which is called the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the, I believe, preoptic area, if I remember correctly. It doesn't matter. It's actually called the goddamn sexually dimorphic nucleus. It is very highly sexually dimorphic. And in humans, the difference between males and females is on average like a couple percent. Like it's this little difference. Whereas in rats, it's like, so again, you can see it with the naked eye. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, just right here, because it's, I haven't studied for this test today. But
well,
as we actually look at, sure.
I sort of find it funny that some people in the chat are like, he's reciting studies and information that well, I know, I understand, but I'm just saying that yes, I came prepared for a discussion, and that's what I intended to have. So that's why I brought in some studies that I had looked at prior to engaging in the conversation.
I thought your topic was about the after. Oh yeah, Mark, I thought your topic was about the afterlife. Did you are you admitting to a bait and switch here?
No, it is about. I would love to discuss the afterlife.
You were prepared for the LGBTQ conversation.
Well, as a Gen Z,
I'm sorry, Mark. I don't believe you.
Well, that's
I see. Here's the thing, Mark. Here's the thing, Mark. We don't believe you at this point, because from the beginning, the fact that you dropped that little tidbit, hoping we would latch onto it to get into the LGBTQ trans conversation.
No, you chose to latch onto it. Yeah, I'm happy to move on.
So yeah, and besides, you just admitted you can't prepare for this conversation, Mark. This is pretty obvious. You did bait and switch here. Why don't you just come here honestly? Like this tells us you're not here in good faith.
I did not do a bait and switch. You chose to engage in the conversation on the pronouns because you asked me what my pronouns were, and I refused to. Okay, that's fine if you don't believe it, but I'm happy to move on and discuss the. Yeah. I always ask my pronouns when I called into the show,
right? By the call screener,
and as
yes.
a Gen Zer, I thought we had moved beyond that.
Right, by the call screener, not by us. And then you started the conversation by talking about pronouns, and we just gave you simple, guided understanding of why we do that. And then you were the one who launched into all this other stuff about biological determinism, which isn't a thing in the way you're making it out to be. That's just not real. And you so far have been the one bringing up these studies that are not actually either saying what you think they're saying or are outdated or what. There are also things I can't verify right now. I'm just sitting here at a computer. But I'm telling you, as someone who has actual training in this area, and with other people who actually specialize in this area, you're wrong. And like, I don't care if you don't believe me. You are. it's like, this is something that people who give a shit about this are not confused about. We are 100% on the same page. I encourage you to check out. I recently released a video over on my channel called Sex and Sensibility, where I break down for about an hour and 40 minutes, like a thorough breakdown of sex, gender, sexuality, what those things are across different species, across different cultures. And I have several reviewers on that. You can go to the description and see. And I've actually got a couple of my neuroscience friends who are PhDs in neuroscience that reviewed that script and verified everything I said about how brains are not sexually dimorphic in this way, that male brain and female brain makes about as much sense as male and female lungs. It just doesn't work that way. So like,
I definitely didn't portray it as just male, female brain. I cited specific studies which show differences in the brain structures of male and female. But also,
yes, and as I've said over and over, Mark, no, you could hold on. Yep. You did say there are specific structures, and I agree that there are specific structures. But what I said that I think you missed is that those structures are neither internally consistent nor reliable in like one. You can't pull out a man's brain and say, okay, it's going to have this anatomy. That doesn't work that way. And they're not internally consistent, which means you're going to have a mosaic of what you would have traditionally assumed were male and female size structures in your brain. And also they vary highly across populations. So all of that is to say, yes, there are dimorphisms. No, they are not reliable. This is exactly the same as when we talk about forensic anthropology and somebody tries to say that male skeletons look like this and female skeletons look like that. It is a gross oversimplification to the point of just being dishonest. And if you know a thing or two about this stuff, you would understand that. But if you just pick up a source that you are not trained to read properly, you wouldn't. And so again, I understand I'm not trying to belittle you or patronize you by saying you're young and you have another chance to study this, but I'm telling you, you're buying into some bullshit that is thoroughly debunked pseudoscience at this point.
Well, that's not, but also to be fair for saying it was dishonest of me to kind of delve into this topic, before I was transferred on the live chat, the person said I was free to delve into other issues. And you can check that recording if you want. He definitely said I was free to delve into whatever issue I wanted to.
Right, but you put in the call screen, you wanted to talk about an afterlife, and then you admitted that you prepared for a conversation about LGBT people. That hints at dishonesty to us, but it genuinely doesn't matter. The fact is that what you're talking about here isn't accurate. Again, biology is thoroughly on the side of LGBT folks as normal, natural variations of human populations. They've been around the whole time.
I never said, yeah, but you're putting words in my mouth now. I never said that LGBTQ people didn't exist. None of the studies that I cited indicated that they don't exist.
And I didn't say you did.
How is it relevant to the debate?
Because you're saying that they are contagious. And that is also something that is thoroughly debunked pseudoscience.
It's really, I'm saying, well, to kind of summarize my point, because I don't know if you fully understood what I was trying to say. I think that the point I was making is that there are differences in male and female brains. We've measured them. There are real differences. They impact the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis. I don't know of any studies that indicate the amount of LGBTQ people prior to the silent generation, prehistoric, Rome, Greece, other civilizations, China. I don't know any studies that indicate the amount of LGBTQ people that were prevalent present in those societies. I'd be happy to read those. But I don't see how you can argue that it's, but I don't see how you can argue that the rate of increase that we've seen is not a byproduct of social contagion if the brain structures that are causing this phenomena are consistent across time. What would cause that dramatic increase? It's not merely social acceptance. I don't believe that.
Those brain structure differences were always there, and now people are being honest about them being there. That's not contagion, that is acceptance. That's how that works.
So you're saying we've seen a five-fold increase in the amount of people identifying as LGBTQ merely because of an expansion of social acceptance?
Literally, yes. I don't know if five-fold increase is accurate or not, but literally, yes. The same amount of people have always been gay and trans, or the same percentage. The same percentage of people have always been LGBT, and now they are allowed to be honest about it without being burned at the stake. And so they are. What's important to remember also is that, you talked about, like, you don't know of any studies that point to the sexuality of these different cultures. The problem with that is that so I should say it this way: gender and sexuality, when you look at it from an anthropological perspective, gender and sexuality have historically been much more associated with socioeconomic status and power than they ever were with, like, just gender or who you're wanting to fuck or anything like that. Those things don't make any sense. It is the way that we classify genders and the way that we categorize sexualities today is a very, very modern invention that would not hold up in even within Western culture past 100 years ago. So as of right now, we are using a very, like, inappropriate measuring tool to try to look at all human society, and that doesn't work. If you want to look into that more, I encourage you to just start studying, like, especially cultural anthropology, but also biological anthropology. It has a lot to say about this, and none of it equates to social contagion in the slightest. This is it's like when we talk about a great example. So a great example of this would be autism. Very quickly, I'm going to give you this last example. A great example is autism. A lot of people like to say that autism is on the rise and that more people are autistic. That's not true. The same amount of people, the same percentage, have always been autistic, and that's nothing changed about that. What we are seeing is an increase in diagnoses. We have better diagnostic criteria. We have better awareness campaigns telling people what to look for. We have better training of mental health professionals. And so we are now diagnosing autism at a higher rate. That doesn't mean more people are autistic. Same thing here. We are now identifying and allowing people to exist as LGBT people. Doesn't mean that any more people are LGBT than ever before. Also, the criteria by which we determine those boxes has changed significantly in the past century. Now, please ask your question.
Just to fully summarize, just so that I understand where you're at in regards to this. During the silent generation, born before 1946, when polled, we went from 1.8% of people identifying as LGBTQ to now Generation Z, people born between 1997 and 2006, we're at 21%. You expect me to believe we went from 1.8% to 21% merely because we changed a social behavior, the way that we quote unquote treat people who identify as LGBTQ? That's your stance.
I don't know how else to actually say this in a way that makes sense. So let's say, just as an example, I don't know what the actual number is, but let's say, just as an example, 30% of all human beings are LGBTQ. Okay, just again, totally just random number I'm pulling out of my ass. Doesn't really mean anything. Just hypothetically, 30% of people are LGBTQ. In a society where LGBTQ people are oppressed and marginalized and looked down on and treated like shit, and they don't have rights, and they're sent to mental asylums for their biology, for who they are as a person, and they're outcast socially, and actually being gay was illegal in this country at one point. You could be arrested for being homosexual. You could be arrested for cross-dressing. Like, If you are in a society where your identity, sexual or gender identity, is criminalized and abused and normalized abuse and violence, then yes, you're going to have a very, very, very small number of those people coming out and saying, yes, I am LGBTQ. 30% of them are LGBTQ. Maybe 1% of them will come out and say that they are because they don't want to be hurt. Then if you go to a different society where you have widespread acceptance of LGBTQ people and they have the same rights and dignity as everybody else, and they're treated totally fairly, and there's no social stigma, and nobody gets arrested or beaten or hurting or evicted or anything like that for their sexuality or gender identity, then a lot more people are going to say, hey, I'm LGBT. It may even be right up to that 30%. Maybe not. Depends on where they live and depends on the culture of their individual little location. And so if you have a society that's changing, as ours is, from the silent generation to now, becoming increasingly more accepting of LGBT people, you would expect to see an increasing number of people admitting to being LGBT, but the whole time, 30% are always LGBT. That is how this works. That is what the data support. That is what reason and common sense supports. There is no evidence that this is a social contagion spreading. There's strong evidence against it. And if you compare this to a model of just a shifting society with increasing acceptance and a standard template number of people identifying in this group without publicly saying it, it matches reality perfectly. I don't know how it can be any more clear than that. If I need to repeat it, I guess I will. But Lord, I don't want to for another time.
Well, I think that also just for the reference, the study that I cited there in reference to the amount of LGBTQ identifying people, that's all Pew Research Center. It's referenced by the Washington Post. It's Gallup.
That changes nothing about what I said.
We're arguing with the numbers.
But the burden. No, wait, Mark. Okay, but let me finish. Wait, you asked me a question.
Hold on.
Let me finish.
No. We're not arguing. I want to get something straight here, and then I'll let you talk. We're not arguing with the numbers you're bringing forward from the research. We're arguing with your explanation for them. And you're hand waving at this 1.8% of the silent generation, 21% today. And you're saying this is all explained by more knowledge and more social acceptance. And I'll go ahead and own and say, yeah, sure. I think that's a reasonable explanation rather than it's a society mind virus. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So as I was saying, I believe the burden of proof, given this information, is on you to prove that it is not a social contagion. I don't think you've given a strong enough argument that just because
that burden of proof,
a change. Wait, can I finish? No, but what you said is that the majority of what you claimed is that what explains the change from that 1.8% to the existing 20+% we see now,
I think,
is a principal change in the way that our society treats a subset of the population. You have not cited a single study that indicates that
I'm
is
using
what drove
the numbers.
that change. You have
hold on, Mark. Yes, we have. We've pointed to a bunch of different examples about society doing certain actions, whether through law or whether it's just general, the way society treats people. The way those attitudes shift affects how people identify themselves and how people express themselves publicly. I didn't say that here's the thing, okay? So you're positing a mind virus, and we're saying, no, we don't think it's that. We think more plausibly it's this other thing. We could both be wrong. There could be a third explanation for why we see it, or it could be a mix of all these things, or maybe some of them. We don't know. We aren't asserting that we are right and you are wrong. We're saying that we find our explanation of the data more plausible than yours. Because we have examples of, let's just take 20th century Germany. All right. I don't have the numbers here, but I can probably guarantee you that if I were to see a line graph of homosexual men in Germany from the 1900s to 2000, I'm going to see a big dip around the time Hitler took power, the Nazis were in charge, and a big upswing once they're out. That's not a social contagion. That's how society was treating those people. And when people are treated poorly because of who they think they are and who they express themselves as, you're going to have people falsely expressing themselves to protect themselves. It's plausible. We've seen it happen so many times. You're here saying, no, it's a mind virus. So
no, that's
I'm not going to
mischaracter. Wait, that's a mischaracterization.
Social contagion.
I'm not
mind
saying
virus.
That's it. No, that's a mischaracterization. I'm not saying that there are not social changes and modifications in the way that we treat people that can have a real and measurable effect in terms of how they identify. I grant that. But I don't think you've presented a strong enough evidence to indicate that it would go from 1.8% to 21%. I'll grant you that there are...
Yeah, it's a
100 years.
It's over a 70-year period. 70-year period?
Yes.
Okay, 70 years, fine. So 70 years. 70 years of scientific progress.
A 10x increase in 70 years of how people sexually identify? That's a huge increase.
Yeah,
that's not that huge.
Increase. Are you kidding me?
That's not really huge at all.
Yeah, no,
there's a massive.
No, it very much is not.
That is a paradigm changing increase.
So
that's ludicrous.
So now you're just appealing. Now you're appealing to incredulity. You're basically saying, I can't see how this can be the case. You guys are crazy for thinking this is the case because I can't understand how this is the case.
You haven't given a strong enough argument to prove that level of increase is not. No, you haven't given a strong enough argument to prove that level of increase is merely driven. I do.
Mark, I don't think you understand what we're saying here. Yeah, go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah, couple of things that are really important. Number one, you brought up, we haven't brought any studies or anything like, we didn't prepare for this. You're allowed to call in and say, you said you prepared for this, but while you were rambling, I went ahead and just pulled up a couple here. Here's from, let's see here. This is from the journal called Cerebral Cortex, published in 2021. This is the title of the article. The human brain is best described as being a male-female continuum, evidence from neuroimaging connectivity studies by Zhang et al. 2021. Here I've got another one. This is from the journal Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. Dump the dimorphism. Comprehensive synthesis of human brain studies reveals few male-female differences beyond size by Elliott et al. In 2021. So there's two studies, both from 2021, that both back up what I'm saying, that these brain differences, of course, there are slight differences, but they're not internally consistent, and it makes no sense to say that there are boy brains and girl brains or anything like that. The second thing that I think is important to point out is that what you are saying is not how science works. You're saying that we need to demonstrate that this isn't a social contagion. That's not how hypothesis testing works. So when you have a hypothesis, when you have an idea that you're trying to test, you have a null hypothesis, and then you have one or more alternative hypotheses. So the null hypothesis is always what I am positing here, that the mechanism that I'm trying to put forth doesn't exist. It isn't real. And when you can statistically verify beyond chance, usually the number we go for is 5%, alpha equals 0.05. If you get what we call a p-value, which means the significance of your findings that is less than 0.05, then that means that there is a less than 5% chance that this is happening by random chance. That's sort of the scientific standard to say that your alternative hypothesis of whatever the thing is you think is happening is actually like possible or useful to think about. For you to say that we have not demonstrated that this social contagion doesn't exist is backwards. The social contagion not being a thing, not being a mechanism of this phenomenon you're seeing, that is the null hypothesis. Remember what I said a minute ago. In science, we do not accept a hypothesis. We fail to reject it. You should always be trying to reject the hypothesis you're making. And one of the ways you reject it is if you don't have enough evidence for it, or you have better explanations that aren't that. And so your alternative hypothesis is that this is a social contagion. The null hypothesis is that this is standard variation that is now being normally expressed. You have not met the burden of proof. You have not met the statistical burden to say that you have a reason to move forward with your hypothesis. So we do not accept that that makes any fucking sense to us. The third and most important thing to remember is something else that I said a minute ago that you might have missed, which is that gender and sexuality have historically been more associated with socioeconomic status and power than the way that we today associate them with who you want to have sex with or what you identify as. The models that you are using right now to determine who is LGBT or what LGBT even means is a social construction of your society in this generation. Go back a couple of generations, it was completely different framework. Go to a different society, it is a completely different framework. Go anywhere around the world throughout history, across cultures, it is a totally different framework. So you are trying to apply very modern and very, very niche heuristics of how sexuality and gender work to try to judge an increase in this population. No matter how you slice that, our model works and your model does not. Are you starting to understand where I'm coming from here from a scientific perspective?
So just to summarize,
that was a yes or no question.
To tell me.
That was a yes or no question.
I just want to. Then no, I think you're completely wrong. I don't think that's how it works at all. But
that's not even what I asked you.
Also, then no, you're definitely, that's not how it works. You're the one making the claim. I said no. You said yes or no. I'm saying no. You're the one making the claim, and I'm saying your evidence has not met that burden.
Okay. I can't help but repeat myself. Do you understand how hypothesis testing works here?
Yes.
Okay. You are presenting the alternative hypothesis. I am presenting the null hypothesis. That means that you have the burden of proof to get to where we fail to reject what you are saying. Without that, it is the scientific approach would be to reject your claim that this is a social contagion. You are proposing a novel mechanism by which natural variation in gender identity and sexuality that we see across humanity and other species as well is somehow now spread. That is a very expensive claim scientifically. It is a big alternative hypothesis that you need to justify. Our null hypothesis is the natural rejection of what you are saying, and it works no matter what paradigm or what heuristic you're using for sex, gender, or sexuality. Yours necessarily only operates under your specific cultural framework and also does not meet its burden of proof. Scientifically speaking, you are lacking both data and rigor and any reason for anybody to take you seriously. Now I will ask you the question that I asked again. Do you understand from a scientific perspective what I am talking about and why I'm rejecting your claim? Whether or not you agree with me, do you understand the scientific method here?
Yes. What you're saying is that the null hypothesis is that there is no effect of social factors.
Yes.
And I'm presenting the alternative hypothesis that the social factors are contributing to an increase.
Yes, precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but again, what this discussion is rooted in is the idea that the increase we've seen in people identifying as LGBTQ, it's still reasonable to suggest my explanation for that is more accurate than yours.
No, it's not. And
it
even if it was
definitely reasonable to suggest that. How can it not be reasonable to suggest that?
Because
there are more
it just shows
explanations.
Exactly. Number one, there's more reasonable explanations, and number two, because you still for some reason don't understand data bias. You have to account for data bias, and you haven't. And all we're doing this entire for 48 fucking minutes, all we're trying to do is get you to comprehend data bias, and you still keep hitting the same wall over and over. and saying, but it's such a big increase. And that's not a scientific argument.
That's not what I just said there, though. I didn't. You recognize that I understood the difference between the null and the alternative hypothesis, but that's not what I was referencing there.
What you just referenced is the same data bias. Go ahead, Eric. What are you saying?
Mark, how is it data bias?
Because you're hand waving at this fivefold increase, as you claim, in almost 2% to 21%, and being gobsmacked by this increase. So, but here's the thing, Mark. Okay, you're skirting very close to a problem here, because you're basically saying that, well, I see these numbers. Here's my explanation. My explanation explains these numbers. Now you're in a position of disproving this, and it's like, no. The explanation you give is one potential explanation. We're not saying it's outright false. We have no idea at this point. We're saying, okay, it could be explained by that, or it could be explained by other things. And those are the things that Forrest and I had mentioned earlier. We're saying these are competing explanations. And with our competing explanations, we have a historical account of these things being the case within societies. And I even said earlier that, hey, maybe we're all wrong about this, and there's some competing other explanation we haven't even touched upon in this conversation. So we're in a position of, we don't accept your explanation. You don't accept ours, and that's fine. But the fact of the matter is that we are not, and like I said, it could be all kinds of different explanations and a blending of them. We're not in a position of saying, oh, well, you haven't disproven my explanation, therefore my explanation must be true until you disprove it, and that's not the case at all. You're skirting very, very close to that kind of a, that's not scientific thinking at all. That's why Forrest was bringing up the null earlier.
I'll grant you. I'll grant you that. I'm not afraid to admit that. I don't think I've presented a strong enough argument to show definitively that the increase that we've seen is outside of what could potentially be caused by changing social conditions. I'd be willing to grant that, but I also don't.
Let me walk you through it piece by piece and show you what data bias means. All right. And why this is a problem, because you just said I love what you just said, but I want to show you how important it is. Okay. First thing, can we agree that there was less societal acceptance of LGBT people in the silent generation?
Yes, I think that's fair to assume.
Okay. I think very much it's not even an assumption. You can check. You don't have to assume. You can go look. Right? What are you saying?
Well, how would you quantify that? How would you quantify that?
We're not asking to quantify. We're just simply saying, was this reasonably the case for some people? And I want to tack on one more question there, and then I'll let Forrest resume. We've established that people reported less because they felt social pressures back then. My question is, do you think there are people who said, I am this, but I am not going to express myself as that publicly back then because of the social consequences? Do you think people like that existed back in the silent generation?
I'm sure they even exist now, yes.
Okay, perfect. Go ahead, Forrest.
Yeah. So there were sodomy laws in the U.S. In fact, in some states there still are. But there was, let's see here, in 1955, what is that? 55. The American Law Institute voted to decriminalize consensual acts of sodomy and remove sodomy as a crime from the penal code in something in Illinois. I'm just pulling up random things. I'm trying to see if this time frame is around the same time, because I know that homosexuality was actually a crime. You could go to jail. Yeah, there were reports of this time of literally you could go to a bar and a man would come and sit down and talk to you. And if you talked to him and had a good conversation, that man was an undercover cop and they'd arrest you because you were under suspicion of being homosexual. And so this was, it looks like around the 1950s. When was, just to double check, when was silent generation? Oh my God. Google, play along, was a little bit before then. It was 1928 to 1945. So in this time that silent generation is around, we have sodomy laws on the books. We have strong anti-homosexual sentiment. I found this random thing it's a Pew Research Center poll with the silent generation being the ages 70 to 87 at the time of this poll, being the only generation to significantly oppose gay marriage more than 50% of the polls. So like, we can agree historically, this is not an assumption, we can agree there is historical record to demonstrate that there was significantly less cultural acceptance of LGBT people in that generation, and there is significantly more now. We're good on that. Premise number 2, would that social pressure alter self-reporting metrics? Would you expect less people who are gay, trans, bisexual, whatever, to self-report as such under those conditions? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. We can look at other historical examples of this. We can look at countries which say that there are no gay people and no trans people in their country. We know that's not possible, right? We also can look across the board that we've observed homosexual behavior in over 1,500 animal species. We know this is a natural occurrence, right? We can look across cultures, and even using our modern metrics of what we define as different sexualities and different gender identities, we can see same distribution across different cultures, across history, across the world. So we know these people exist. We know that there was a different attitude. We can expect difference in reporting. Now, if you're going to say that our model, the null hypothesis here, that the more acceptance leads to more accurate reporting, if you say that that is not accurate, how do you account for what you just admitted would produce those same results? How do you change that in your data? How do you account for that in your analysis? How do you make sure that those things aren't influencing your interpretation of the data you've been reading?
Let me ask a clarifying question. I would agree with you that more accurate data has been available over time on the prevalence of LGBTQ people due to the changes that have been made in our society, which you've referenced. I would agree with you. But I still don't see how what you've presented necessarily invalidates the data, though.
It doesn't.
Maybe this can help, Mark.
Also, I would like you to answer my question. Sorry, Eric, I don't mean to cut you off, but Mark, you said you wanted a clarifying question, then you didn't ask a question. So I'm going to ask you the same question. You just agreed with our position that we have had the same amount of homosexuals this whole time, and we had different attitudes towards homosexuality back in the day, and that negatively impacted people's likelihood to self-report. That is the position that we are taking to fully explain this entire change in data. You are now proposing an additional concept, this additional mechanism. How do you account for that change in data, that bias in the data? That is what data bias means. That bias in the data, that people weren't reporting high numbers because they were societally encouraged not to, versus today when they are allowed to. How do you account for that in your analysis of the data that allows you to come to the conclusion that there must be some other factor at play?
Because when I look at the data that I cited, the data which we're sort of discussing here, that we are discussing here, millennials born between 1981 and 1966, it was 12%. Generation Z, it's 21%. You're telling me, I'm a late Gen Zer, 1999. I know that the changes in our society were not nearly as dramatic in comparison to 1946 to 1980. So you still saw
what might have happened. What might have happened?
A doubling.
What might have happened in that time period that could have helped increase public perception and acceptance?
Off the top of my head, legalization of gay marriage, for example.
That was much, much later. Much, much later. So 2 things. Number 1, in 2003, just 4 years after you were born, the Supreme Court actually made sodomy legal, overturned sodomy laws in the United States. Same-sex sexual activity was still illegal in parts of the country 4 years after you were born. So that's a major thing. You are now no longer going to go to jail if you admit to practicing your sexual orientation. That's a major one. The second one is the thing that you are using to communicate with us right now. Cell phones and internet. You have massive amplification and proliferation of social media technologies, allowing young people to collaborate, talk, share experiences, share worldviews, share ideas, which is historically, in several cases, associated with massive paradigm shifts in cultural perception, especially those around civil rights. So you have unprecedented changes in technology and unprecedented change in law at the exact time that you're talking about that would cause people coming of age in that time to now be more confident in reporting themselves as LGBT on census polls when they become adults. That is an explanation for the data bias that you're seeing that still factors in to the null hypothesis that we are proposing. Now, what is your analysis that gives any credence to the alternative hypothesis that you have still not presented any evidence for?
I think I definitely presented evidence. I don't think it's fair to say I presented no evidence. You refuted some of it. Well, I mean,
evidence have you proposed?
In relationship to the increase in people identifying as LGBTQ?
You have presented one data set which shows an increase in people self-reporting as LGBT over the course of about 100 years. You have shown one data set which shows the increase. That is an observation. That is just demographic data. That is not research. That is the observation that leads you to then make the claim. So that is not evidence of a social contagion. That is the observation that makes you ask why.
Okay, I can present a data point. I can present a data point right now indicating that the increase in the amount of people identifying as LGBTQ post 2000 is primarily a social phenomena. Is that evidence?
If you have evidence of that, I would love to hear it. I would love to hear it if you have evidence of that.
Okay, you can go to the National Library of Medicine, National Center for Biotechnology Information. You can see elevated rates of neurodevelopmental and psychiatric diagnosis in relationship to people identifying with transgenderism or gender diverse individuals.
An increase during what time?
It looks like it was 641,860 people between 2005 and 2015.
It
showed an increase.
Thing. Fuck, man. That is the exact same thing we just went over. That is a data set that is showing demographic data from self-reporting. It's self-reporting, right?
I'm not sure on this one, to be honest.
That is demographic data showing an increase in identification within this population, within this social group. That is not evidence for a social contagion. That is the exact same thing as your original data set, and it still factors into the null hypothesis that we're presenting, and you still have no evidence of the alternative hypothesis that you are presenting. Therefore, it is scientifically reasonable to reject it.
I don't think that. I think that's too strong to say it's scientifically unreasonable to reject it. How is it scientifically reasonable to reject the hypothesis? Here's my hypothesis. My hypothesis is the increase in the amount of people identifying as LGBTQ that we have seen is not merely do to changing the laws that govern our society or social interactions.
Right.
In a positive way.
You've been saying it on repeat. You've been saying it on repeat for an hour. I know.
Well, also, it's interesting how you brought up that that white lady who raised money for she called that guy, a kid the N-word and raised $500,000, but you didn't talk about Carmelo Anthony, who murdered someone.
So now you're just going to pivot.
What kind of
stabbed him? Stabbed him in the heart.
What kind of pivot, Mark? Let's not pivot.
I mute him for a second.
Yeah. Mark, I'm gonna wrap up everything here, and hopefully in a nice, succinct manner here. All right, you are pointing to this drastic increase in numbers from 1.8% in the silent generation to 21% during Generation Z, and you're saying that, wow, what do we have to explain this drastic increase? Forrest and I brought some stuff to the table, and you brought your thing to the table, and then later on in the conversation, you admitted that our explanations of social allowance, general knowledge. Forrest then later brought up things like the internet and the dissemination of knowledge and people learning more about things from other people and getting more knowledge about the subject. All of these things are factors in that number going up. And I think I might have heard you right, but maybe I didn't, that you think that this is a sufficient explanation. We think this is a sufficient explanation for the numbers increasing. Your hang up is you don't think it's a sufficient explanation for these numbers increasing so much. And you want to add in social contagion to compensate or to account for whatever number you think is not reasonably explained by our explanations. So you have a burden of proof, because Forrest and I think that our explanation is sufficient and handles it and everything. Societies change over time, especially with the advent of new technology, the rescinding of laws that are hostile towards these types of people, just like we saw back in Germany. We think this is a sufficient explanation for what we see. We don't see that we need to add in stuff like social contagions. We're just going to Occam's razor that shit right out of there because we don't need it as an explanation, and it's not supported. That's this conversation in a nutshell. So, Mark, do you have any evidence that can show us that it's a social contagion?
You have not shown the baseline amount of people throughout let me finish. You have not shown what percent of people throughout all of history identify as LGBTQ. You're claiming the increase that we've seen is not due to social contagion, but you haven't presented any evidence when I have presented evidence that is not what we would see.
We didn't, Mark. Okay, we shouldn't have been clear about this at the beginning. We are not saying the social contagion explanation is false. It could be true. We don't see a reason for it to be true, but it could be true. All right. But we reject it because we don't see that it's supported by anything and it's not needed. You understand the difference between rejecting an explanation and declaring that explanation false, right?
If you're merely rejecting the explanation, I would accept that.
That's what we've been doing this entire time.
That's literally how science skepticism works.
We don't see anything. Yeah, that's why the null hypothesis is there. That's why what Forrest was getting to earlier. We don't see a reason to adopt this as an explanation. You have thus far failed to show us why, and we don't think it's needed because we have other, as I mentioned earlier, more plausible, historically accounted for explanations for why we see this phenomenon. Now, if you don't like the numbers and you think the numbers are too spectacular to be explained by this, that's fine. You need to find evidence supporting your explanation to account for that. That's not on us to disprove.
Yeah, here's the thing, man, is that we've talked to you we've been talking to you for about an hour and 8 minutes, which is about an hour and 7 minutes longer than you would be taken seriously in any actual academic setting, bringing this level of nonsense into this conversation. You have presented no positive evidence for your position. You have not accounted for how your data is collected or how you're analyzing it. You haven't accounted for any matter of bias, and you've constantly accused us of not meeting our burden of proof when we are actually just practicing how the scientific method is actually done. Not to mention the fact that what you said we can't explain, the increase over time, the increase across cultures, the standard base level of across cultures, I have actually presented things to you that explain those things that are not only factual, because I fucking like I can pull out any number of, I've got like 5 textbooks around me at this moment that can go through this for you, but more importantly, are actually the academic consensus in the areas that I am presenting to you, not just bioanthropology and cultural anthropology, but modern biomedical science as well. I am presenting you with the best understanding that we have of this stuff based on formal training in these areas that is actually rooted in real evidence, which I actually even did cite you a couple of studies when you asked for them. And you've hand waved them away and continue to just say that your assumption of a social contagion based on demographic data is good enough when it simply isn't. You have not done good science here. And I understand that you're very young and you haven't had the opportunity to learn that yet. That's fine. I've been giving you way more passes than I would give anybody else. But I'm warning you, Mark, you're on a dangerous road into really genuinely stupid thinking. And that leads people down some fucking dark paths. So I encourage you to go learn how scientific thinking works and go learn how to actually test these ideas and go study anthropology and biomed and learn what actual experts in this area are saying about these things, because I guarantee you it is nothing like what you presented for the past hour and 10 minutes on this call. And with that, we're going to move on.
Well,
Mark,
okay, wait. I'll say one thing.
I'm not going to let you say one thing, because the last time you were backed into a corner, you pivoted to some dumb shit about, well, what about this evil black man? And it just showed extreme cowardice and lack of respect for just how thinking works. So I'm not really interested in hearing the one thing you have to say, Mark. You kind of shit all over yourself there, and I don't want to have it happen anymore. So with that, Eric, do you have anything left for Mark?
No, nothing we haven't talked about before. I still don't think Mark called in about the afterlife. I don't think. The whole conversation screams to me about ulterior motives. So, Mark, if you're a Christian, I wonder how your God looks upon, bearing false witness and false pretenses. But that's a good question. That's something you can think about on your own.
Yeah. Anyway, take care, Mark. What a disappointment.
Hey, if you liked this video, why don't you click that like button?
And if you didn't
like it, you would say,
subscribe.
Okay.
You didn't give me a chance.
There was such a long pause.
What are you on speed or something?
Sorry.
I barely had a chance.
Let's try again. Hey, I hope you liked. Hey, I hope you. Hey there. I hope you liked that clip. Hey, I hope you liked that clipper just now. The one that you just watched with your eyes. If you did like it, why don't you click that like button?
And if you didn't like it, tell Jimmy to go fuck himself.
Hey, I hope you liked that clip right now. If you did like it, why don't you hit that like button?
And if you didn't like it, go ahead and subscribe anyway.